Inheriting a collapsing, rat-infested coastal shack from an eccentric uncle felt like a cruel joke, especially with a bank account dwindling to a mere $42. But hundreds of miles from home, a chance stumble over a moldy rug reveals a heavy steel trapdoor hidden in the floorboards. The discovery buried beneath it contains a centuries-old secret capable of upending American history, while painting a massive, inescapable target squarely on the finder's back. Arturo Kensington was a man who understood numbers, which is why he knew precisely how utterly ruined his life had become. Sitting in his cramped, unheated Houston apartment, the 34-year-old former accountant stared at the foreclosure notice on his desk. The collapse of his independent tax firm, followed by a brutal legal battle with a former business partner, had left him with a mountain of debt that eclipsed $400,000. He was drowning, and the water was rising fast. Then came the phone call that seemed like a cruel joke. The voice on the other end belonged to Eugene Abernathy, a weary-sounding estate lawyer based out of Portland, Maine. Arturo's great-uncle, Harrison Kensington, had passed away at the age of 89. Harrison was a ghost in the family tree, a notoriously paranoid recluse who hadn't spoken to a living relative since the late 1980s. Yet for reasons Abernathy couldn't explain, Arturo was named the sole beneficiary of Harrison's entire estate. Hope, a dangerous and intoxicating emotion, flared in Arturo's chest. The Kensington name used to mean old money. Perhaps the old man had hoarded a fortune in stocks or a sprawling Victorian mansion on the coast. Arturo scraped together the last of his credit, rented a heavily dented sedan, and drove 22 hours straight to the remote, fog-choked fishing village of Oakhaven, Maine. He arrived with visions of salvation. What he found was a monument to decay. The estate was located at the very edge of Widow's Point, a jagged peninsula of black rock constantly battered by the churning, freezing Atlantic. Sitting precariously on the cliffside was a shack. It was a miserable, asymmetrical structure of rotting, salt-bleached wood and a sagging tar paper roof. The front porch leaned so heavily to the left, it looked as though it were preparing to dive into the ocean. The air around it smelled violently of dead fish, rotting kelp, and decades of neglect. Arturo stood in the freezing drizzle, staring at his inheritance. This wasn't salvation. This was a punchline. He unlocked the front door, using the rusted iron key Abernathy had mailed him. The door groaned open, scraping against warped floorboards. Inside, the gloom was oppressive. There was no electricity, no running water. The furniture consisted of a stained mattress on a rusty iron frame, a single wooden chair, and a cast-iron stove, thick with orange rust. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through grimy, cracked windows. "Sign the deed over to the county, Mr. Kensington," Abernathy had advised him over the phone. "The property taxes are in arrears, and the land isn't zoned for commercial development. It's a liability." Arturo threw his duffel bag onto the mattress, a profound wave of exhaustion and despair washing over him. He had spent his last dollars getting here. He couldn't even afford gas to drive back to Houston. He was trapped at the edge of the world in a wooden box that smelled of mildew and failure. As night fell, a violent nor'easter rolled in off the ocean. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the walls, and the shack rattled so violently, Arturo feared it would be torn from its foundation. He huddled under his damp coat on the mattress, listening to the rain violently lash the roof. Around 2 a.m., a steady drip, drip, drip began landing directly on his forehead. Cursing into the darkness, Arturo stood up, grabbed the heavy iron frame of the bed, and dragged it across the room to escape the leak. As he pulled the bed, One of the iron legs caught the edge of a heavy, foul-smelling Persian rug that covered the center of the room. The rug, stiff with years of dirt and salt, bunched up and flipped over. Arturo's foot slipped on the bare floorboards underneath, but instead of the dull thud of wood, his boot struck something hard, something that produced a hollow, metallic clank. He froze. Fumbling in his pocket, he pulled out his smartphone, using its weak flashlight app to pierce the gloom. He aimed the beam at the floor. There, perfectly flush with the rotting floorboards, was a heavy square of blackened steel. It was bordered by thick rivets, and in the center lay a recessed, heavy iron pull ring. It looked like a hatch from a submarine, completely incongruous with the flimsy, rotting wood of the shack. Arturo's heart hammered against his ribs. He knelt, tracing his fingers over the cold metal. It was locked down with a heavy, modern brass padlock, a master lock that looked entirely out of place, seemingly installed within the last few years. He needed to get it open. Arturo searched the shack frantically. Near the rusted stove, he found a heavy iron fireplace poker. Returning to the hatch, he wedged the pointed end of the poker into the shackle of the padlock. He leveraged his entire body weight against the iron bar. His muscles screamed, the rusted poker biting into his palms. With a sharp, violent crack, the brass lock shattered. Arturo tossed the poker aside. He grabbed the iron pull ring with both hands, planted his boots on the floorboards, and pulled. It was incredibly heavy, protesting with a screech of long, dormant hinges. As the steel door swung upward and fell back against the floorboards, a rush of air hit Arturo's face. It didn't smell like damp earth or mold. It smelled like dry dust, old paper, and something metallic. Aiming his phone's flashlight down into the abyss, Arturo saw a set of perfectly constructed concrete stairs leading down into total darkness. Arturo descended slowly, the concrete cold and slick under his boots. The stairs went impossibly deep, far deeper than the shallow foundation of the shack above would suggest. He counted 30 steps before his feet hit a solid, level floor. He swept the weak beam of his phone around the space, his breath catching in his throat. This was no root cellar. It was a massive, subterranean vault. The walls were lined with dry, meticulously laid red brick. Thick oak beams supported the ceiling, heavily reinforced with modern steel brackets. Great-Uncle Harrison hadn't just been living in a shack. He had been guarding a fortress. The air was artificially dry. Arturo noticed a quiet, steady hum and traced it to a high-end commercial dehumidifier tucked into the corner, powered by a heavy-duty cable that disappeared into the brickwork, likely siphoning off the town's municipal grid illegally. But it was what filled the center of the room that made Arturo drop to his knees. Stacked atop wooden pallets were dozens of heavy, iron-bound strongboxes. Alongside them sat wooden crates, sealed with thick, cracked wax, and several large cylindrical objects wrapped tightly in canvas. Arturo crawled toward the nearest strongbox. The latch was unpadlocked, secured only by a stiff, rusted hasp. He pried it open with his bare hands, tearing his cuticle in the process. But he didn't feel the pain. He threw back the heavy lid. The light from his phone reflected off a sea of dull yellow. Arturo gasped, falling backward onto the dusty floor. He scrambled forward again, plunging his hands into the box. Gold. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of heavy, irregular gold coins. They were cold, heavy, and undeniably real. He picked one up, bringing it inches from his face. It bore the profile of King George III. The date stamped on the bottom read, 1776. Arturo's mind raced, struggling to process the impossible reality. Beside the gold lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle. He carefully flipped it open. The elegant, looping cursive handwriting at the top of the first page read, "Consignment of His Majesty's Treasury, removed from Boston under the command of General Thomas Gage. Entrusted to Captain Horatio Kensington, HMS Valkyrie. To be hidden until the rebellion is crushed." Arturo stared at the words. This wasn't just gold. This was the legendary lost payroll of the British Loyalist Army, a historical myth that treasure hunters had spent lifetimes chasing. It was a fortune that had vanished from Boston Harbor right before Washington's forces took the city. And it had been sitting under his family's rotting fishing shack for over 2 centuries. He was rich, not just debt-free. He was wealthy beyond comprehension. A single one of these coins would fetch tens of thousands at Sotheby's. There were thousands of them here, to say nothing of the artifacts in the other crates. Okay, Arturo, breathe," he whispered into the silent vault. "You just need to secure it. You need an appraiser. You need to call—" Thump. Arturo froze. The blood drained from his face. The sound had come from above, inside the shack. Thump. Creak. Heavy footsteps were moving across the floorboards, directly over his head. Arturo instantly clicked off his phone's flashlight, plunging the vault into absolute, suffocating darkness. He held his breath, his heart hammering so violently he was sure the intruders could hear it through the floor. "I'm telling you, Mr. Gable, the old freak didn't leave anything up here." A gruff, gravelly voice echoed down the stairwell. The acoustics of the brick vault amplified the sound perfectly. Harrison Kensington was a paranoid lunatic, but he wasn't stupid, Cole, a second voice replied. This voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with authority. The original land grants explicitly place the Loyalist cache on this exact promontory. My family has been trying to buy this worthless plot of land for 4 generations. He's hiding it here. I know it. Arturo recognized the name. Richard Gable. When Arturo had stopped at a local diner for a coffee upon arriving in Oakhaven, the waitress had complained about Gable. He was a ruthless real estate developer and amateur historian who effectively owned the town, the mayor, the police, and the docks. Well, the nephew is here, the gruff voice, Cole, said. Saw his rental car out front. Smells like he was just here. Stove's still warm. Find him, Gable ordered, his voice cold and devoid of empathy. If he hasn't found it yet, we force him to sign the deed over. I have the paperwork ready. If he has found it, Gable paused, and the silence hung heavy with violent implication. The cliffs are steep. Tourists fall to the rocks all the time. It's a tragic, slippery coast, Cole. In the pitch black of the vault, Arturo clamped a hand over his own mouth to stifle his panicked breathing. Hey, Mr. Gable, Cole's voice suddenly boomed, much closer to the top of the stairs. The bed's been moved. Look at this rug. Arturo's eyes widened in the dark. He had left the trap door wide open. Well. Gable's smooth voice drifted down, echoing menacingly down the concrete stairwell. It seems our Mr. Kensington has been busy. Cole, get your flashlight. Let's go welcome the new neighbor to Oakhaven. Arturo was trapped. There was no back exit. He was 50 feet underground, cornered in a vault of historical gold, with a corrupt millionaire and a hired killer descending the stairs. His inheritance had just turned into his tomb. Arturo backed away from the stairs, his hands blindly feeling along the rough brick wall. His fingers brushed against something hard and wooden, A crate. He ducked behind a stack of the heavy, wax-sealed boxes, making himself as small as possible in the suffocating darkness. A beam of bright LED light pierced the gloom of the vault, sweeping down the stairs. The heavy thudding boots of Cole and Gable began their descent. "Watch your step," Gable murmured, his voice echoing. "This is it. After 200 years, we've found it." Arturo gripped the heavy iron fireplace poker he had brought down with him, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't a fighter. He was an accountant. But as the beam of light swept across the vault, illuminating the open strongbox of gold and moving steadily toward his hiding spot, Arturo realized the numbers had suddenly changed. It was no longer a calculation of debt and assets. It was a simple equation of survival. The beam of Cole's heavy tactical flashlight sliced through the dusty air of the vault, illuminating the red brick walls and the wooden pallets. Arturo pressed his back so hard against the rough bricks he felt them biting into his spine. He held his breath, his eyes wool in the suffocating darkness, listening to the heavy, arrogant footsteps of Richard Gable and his enforcer. "God above," Gable whispered. The cultured smoothness of his voice was gone, replaced by a ragged, breathless greed. The flashlight beam settled on the open iron-bound strongbox. The dull, hypnotic glow of the 1776 British Loyalist gold reflected in the light. "Look at it, Cole. Millions, tens of millions in historical value." Gable's footsteps hurried across the concrete floor, stopping mere feet from where Arturo was crouched behind the stacked, wax-sealed crates. "My grandfather spent his entire fortune dredging the bay looking for the HMS Valkyrie, and this paranoid old fool had it buried under his bed the entire time." "Mr. Gable," Cole's gruff voice interrupted, tinged with a sudden edge of nervousness. "The lid on this box, it's open. The dust on the floor. Someone was just walking around down here. He's in this room." The flashlight beam snapped away from the gold, sweeping violently across the vault. Arturo's mind went blank with terror, but the primal instinct to survive overrode his panic. He looked down at his feet. Snaking across the floorboards, inches from his boots, was the heavy-duty orange extension cord powering the industrial dehumidifier in the corner. It ran directly across the path between Cole and the stairs. The beam of light was moving closer, illuminating the edges of the crates hiding him. In 2 seconds, he would be exposed. Arturo didn't think. He reacted. He reached down, grabbed the thick orange cable with his free hand, and violently yanked it upward with all his remaining strength. The cord snapped taut like a tripwire just as Cole took a step forward. The massive enforcer let out a startled grunt as his combat boot caught the heavy cable. He pitched forward, his arms flailing. The heavy tactical flashlight slipped from his grip, flying through the air and smashing lens first into the solid brick wall. The glass shattered with a sharp crack, and the vault was instantly plunged back into absolute, impenetrable darkness. "Get him!" Gable shrieked, his voice echoing frantically off the brick walls. "He's in the corner!" Arturo dropped the cable and scrambled over the rough wooden pallets. He knew he only had a few seconds of confusion before their eyes adjusted to the pitch black, or before they pulled out a phone light. He heard Cole cursing violently, scrambling on the concrete floor. Arturo stayed low, crawling frantically toward where he knew the base of the concrete stairs was. His knee slammed into a hard wooden edge, sending a flare of pain up his leg, but he pushed forward. "I've got a lighter!" Gable yelled over the chaos. A moment later, the small, flickering orange flame of a Zippo lighter illuminated the center of the room. The dim light caught Arturo just as he reached the bottom step. "There," Gable pointed. Cole lunged out of the gloom like a massive, angry bear. His thick hands grabbed the fabric of Arturo's coat, yanking him backward with terrifying force. Arturo stumbled, dropping the heavy iron fireplace poker. Desperation fueled Arturo's next move. As he fell backward, he planted his left boot squarely into Cole's chest and kicked out with everything he had. The blow winded the larger man, breaking his grip. Arturo scrambled on his hands and knees up the concrete steps, tearing his fingernails on the rough stone. "Don't let him out!" Gable screamed. The Zippo flame shaking in his hand. Arturo reached the top of the stairs, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He threw himself onto the rotting floorboards of the shack, grabbed the heavy iron pull ring of the steel trapdoor, and heaved it upward. The door was impossibly heavy, but adrenaline is a powerful equalizer. As Cole's heavy boots began thundering up the concrete steps beneath him, Arturo slammed the steel hatch down. Clang! The sound was deafening. Arturo immediately threw his body weight on top of the door. From underneath, a massive force slammed into the steel as Cole tried to push it open. Arturo was thrown a few inches into the air, but the door held. Frantically, Arturo scanned the edges of the hatch in the dim moonlight, filtering through the shack's windows. Great-Uncle Harrison had been paranoid about people getting in, but he had also installed a fail-safe to keep people down. A heavy, sliding iron deadbolt was mounted to the floorboards, designed to lock the hatch from the outside. Cole hit the door again from below, roaring in frustration. Arturo slammed the iron deadbolt home, the rusted metal screeching in protest before locking securely into place. Arturo collapsed onto the moldy rug, gasping for air. Beneath him, the muffled, enraged shouts of Richard Gable and Cole echoed through the floorboards. They were trapped 50 feet underground in a soundproof brick vault, but Arturo knew he wasn't safe yet. Gable effectively owned the Oakhaven police force. If Arturo called 911, the responding officers would likely shoot him for trespassing and quietly release their wealthy benefactor. Arturo needed leverage. He needed an authority that Gable's money couldn't reach. He stumbled out of the rotting shack into the freezing Maine rain, threw himself into his dented rental car, and locked the doors. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone and the single object he had managed to grab before the chaos began: one heavy 1776 British Loyalist gold coin. He didn't call the local police. He searched the internet for the nearest federal authority with jurisdiction over stolen antiquities. 2 hours later, Arturo sat in the sterile, brightly lit interrogation room of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's field office in Portland, Maine. Across from him sat Special Agent Thomas Bradley, a seasoned veteran of the FBI's art crime team. Agent Bradley stared at the gold coin resting on the metal table between them. He picked it up with a gloved hand, examining the worn profile of King George III under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You are telling me," Agent Bradley began, his voice slow and deliberate, "that you have Richard Gable, the CEO of Gable Coastal Developments, locked in a subterranean vault under a fishing shack, surrounded by the lost payroll of the British Loyalist Army." "Yes, sir," Arturo replied, his clothes still damp, his hands shaking slightly from the fading adrenaline. "And he explicitly threatened to throw me off Widow's Point. His man, Cole, assaulted me. If you send local cops, they'll cover it up. You have to send federal agents. Now!" Agent Bradley looked at the coin, then back at Arturo. He picked up his desk phone. "Get me the director. We're authorizing a tactical raid on Widow's Point, and bring the Historic Preservation Unit." What followed was a spectacle that the quiet town of Oakhaven would talk about for decades. Just before dawn, a convoy of 6 black tactical SUVs tore down the narrow, winding coastal road to Widow's Point. Heavily armed federal agents breached the rotting shack. When they threw back the rug and unbolted the steel hatch, they found Richard Gable and Cole shivering in the damp chill of the vault, surrounded by a fortune they couldn't spend. Gable tried to threaten the agents, citing his wealth and local influence. Agent Bradley simply read him his Miranda rights and slapped him in federal handcuffs. The subsequent investigation tore the lid off Oakhaven's dark underbelly. Gable's arrest triggered a massive audit of his development company, revealing decades of bribery, intimidation, and local corruption. But for Arturo, the real battle was just beginning. The battle for the vault. The legal complexities of finding a 200-year-old British military fortune on private American soil were staggering. The British government immediately filed a claim. The state of Maine invoked historic preservation laws. The Smithsonian Institution petitioned for custodial rights. However, Arturo's estate lawyer, Eugene Abernathy, proved to be far more ruthless than he initially appeared. Abernathy invoked a combination of the law of fines and complex maritime salvage laws, arguing that the HMS Valkyrie's cargo had been legally abandoned on private property during an act of war. After a grueling 14-month legal war, a federal judge handed down a historic ruling. A compromise was struck. The Oakhaven settlement, the Crown's cut. The British government was allowed to repatriate specific historical documents and 20% of the minted coins for their national museums. The state's share. The state of Maine received several of the wax-sealed crates which contained perfectly preserved colonial muskets and loyalist correspondence, establishing a new permanent wing at the State Museum. Arturo's reward. Arturo was granted full legal ownership of the remaining 80% of the gold cash, recognized not as stolen property, but as a legally inherited familial asset. The sheer volume of the treasure was staggering once the FBI completed their official inventory. Arturo Kensington, the bankrupt accountant from Houston, walked out of the federal courthouse a multi-millionaire. He paid off his $400,000 in debt with a single wire transfer. But the final twist of the story came weeks later, when Arturo finally had the time to sit down and read through Great-Uncle Harrison's brittle, leather-bound ledger in a secure, climate-controlled facility. The ledger didn't just contain the inventory of the loyalist gold. The final pages were written in a different, much shakier hand. Harrison's handwriting, dated just months before his death. To whoever inherits this burden, the gold is cursed by the blood of the men who stole it, but the land it sits on is the true weapon. Gable's grandfather murdered my father for this land, knowing the vault was here, but he could never find the entrance. I leave this to you not to make you wealthy, but because the Gable family needs the deep water access of Widow's Point to finalize their coastal monopoly. Bleed them dry. Harrison hadn't just left Arturo a fortune. He had left him a loaded gun aimed directly at the people who had terrorized his family for generations. Arturo didn't keep the rotting shack. Once the vault was emptied, he put the barren, jagged peninsula of Widow's Point up for sale. But he didn't sell it to a developer. He sold it for a nominal fee of $1 to the Maine Coastal Conservancy, ensuring that the land could never be built upon, permanently destroying Gable Coastal Development's plans for a deep-water port and effectively bankrupting Gable's remaining shareholders. Arturo bought a quiet, comfortable house in the mountains of Colorado, far away from the ocean, the fog, and the suffocating greed of Oakhaven. He invested his wealth quietly, returning to his roots in accounting. But this time, he only managed one portfolio. His own. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the mountain pines, Arturo would close his eyes and remember the smell of salt air, the cold touch of 18th century gold, and the hollow, metallic clank of a steel trap door hiding beneath a ruined rug. He had inherited rot and ruin, but beneath the surface, he had found the strength to rewrite history. Did Arturo make the right choice by handing the treasure over to the feds instead of selling it on the black market? What would you do if you found a secret historical vault under your floorboards? If this incredible true story of hidden secrets, betrayal, and sudden wealth kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your fellow treasure hunters, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life mysteries.